Okay, today we are going to begin the study of the book of Romans. This is one of the big ones. This is one of the books that explains much of the rest of the Bible. If you take this book, I would say, this is my, Aaron Franklin, my personal view on the matter. If you take Romans and Ephesians and Hebrews, and you understand those three books in particular, you pretty much understand the message of the Bible. These letters, and we haven't gotten to Ephesians or Hebrews yet, we're doing Romans now. Within this letter, and like I say also in Ephesians and Hebrews, you get pretty much a full explanation of why God did what he did, and why the world is the way it is. We don't get this earlier. You know, the pattern throughout the Bible is that we get the what, and then later on we get the why. We see what happened, and then later on we get the explanation of why that happened. We see what God did or said or commanded, and then later on we see what. In some cases it's left forever ambiguous. For example, we still don't really know why he declared certain foods unclean and not others. It could be related to health, but that's supposition. We don't really know that. Nothing in the Bible ever completely eliminates that. But so it doesn't reveal everything to us. But you know, you go back to, I've read this before, Deuteronomy 29, as Moses is giving his farewell address to the nation of Israel, he says, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law." Well, at that point in time, all they had was this. And since Moses died, we've had the rest of this added too. So more things have been revealed. More things that God had kept secret, even from Moses, have been revealed since then. Not everything, though. But more things. And within this letter of Romans, and I would also add to that Ephesians and Hebrews as well, we get most of the whys. We get most of the explanation for why the world is the way it is and why God did what he did. In particular, we get the whys about justification and righteousness. In the book of Romans, we're going to find out, more clearly expressed than anywhere else, how everyone in the world is under sin. Everyone in the world, no matter your background, whether you're a Jew or Gentile, whether you have a privileged, advantage relationship with God, you know, you're in a natural advantage or not, and we'll get to what that means later. Doesn't matter. Everyone is under sin. And no one can correct your own. You can't forgive your own sin. You can't make do with your own sin. Anytime, you know, we read in Galatians that, and we'll read this we'll look at this as we actually read the book of Romans, that one offense makes one a lawbreaker. And everybody commits an offense at some point or another. You don't even have to have God's own law for that to happen. Because God only gave his law to a specific group of people at a specific point in time for a specific period of time. If you ever lived outside that group of people in that time frame, you weren't technically under God's written law, but that doesn't make you exempt. And if you were under God's written law, that doesn't make you special. It doesn't make you. It does give you advantages, but it doesn't make you automatically holy or righteous. Everybody is under sin. Everybody stands guilty. The language in Romans is very legal in nature. It's indicative of law courts. This is a little high, actually. It's a little strange to us. Most of us today, including myself, thankfully, up to this point in my life, have not experienced personally the law system. You know, thankfully, you haven't been in a lawsuit either as a plaintiff or a defendant. But that would have been, and when you do have such a thing happen, when you do have a lawsuit, a court case carry out, it's inside some special building somewhere. Now, in some cases, these trials, these law courts, are open to the public. Sometimes they're not. But even when they are, they're still inside some special, the courthouse, some special building somewhere, very large, imposing, and intimidating. And most people don't hang out around these places for fun. But in Paul's day, and throughout the ancient world, court cases were handled in the public at the city gates and in the city square out in the open. And everyone would be familiar with the proceedings because they would have been public in front of everybody when they were taking place. Even if you weren't involved, you would know how the system worked because you would have been exposed to it constantly on a daily basis. And so Paul's framework here in Romans, I still don't have that right. I'll fix that for the next video. Paul's framework here in Romans is that all of humanity is being brought to trial before God, and on our own we are declared guilty because we are guilty. All you have to do is commit one sin and you're guilty. And it doesn't even have to be against the actual written law of God, as we'll find out in Romans. You can sin against the law of the land, and that's guilt, and that makes you guilty, because God invested, as much as we may not like it sometimes, and most human beings throughout the world have lived under bad governments. But as much as we may not like it, God invested human authorities with their authority. Now He makes them rise up, He makes them fall down. If they go too far, if they go against His will too far, and almost all human governments throughout the history of the world have gone against His will. But there comes a point when He dismisses them and replaces them with something else. It happens. It has happened. It will continue to happen. So whatever we think of it, most of us aren't going to like it. The fact is that God invested the human authorities that are in control of the world throughout the present, in the present and throughout the past, with their authority, and to sin against the authorities is to sin against God, even if those authorities aren't acting favorably themselves towards God. You can even sin against your own conscience. If you do something, and I am not going to listen to anybody over the age of maybe 5, and even not, especially not even a 5-year-old. Nobody can claim that you've never acted against your own conscience, okay? Nobody in the history of the world can make this claim. As long as you are mentally developed enough to even understand this, which some people, granted, are not. Some people do have mental handicaps that make them, even when their bodies grow up, their minds never do. That does happen. I don't know what the Bible would say about that. I don't know if that sort of mental handicap was really, they probably would have just seen it as a kind of demon possession. I really don't know, but unless you are literally so far gone with Down syndrome or some other birth defect that you cannot develop a sense of conscience, everybody in the world has sinned against their conscience. Everybody has. And that counts too, as we'll read about in Romans. You can sin against your own conscience, and that itself condemns you. And you only have to do that once to be condemned. When you stand before God, and with God as a judge and you as the defendant, and as it turns out, Satan as the prosecutor, you're going to be declared guilty. Unless somehow, through some way, there's some intervention in which you can be declared righteous. And that's what the book of Romans explains. We read about this in the Gospels because Jesus' ministry is to provide a way for us to be declared righteous, so that we don't have to face the condemnation of a sinner, which we all should because we're all sinners. We read about that in the action in the Gospels, which we spent a year working on those Gospels. However, the Gospels themselves don't actually explain why these things are happening. They record what Jesus did, and they record what Jesus said, and they record how people responded to Jesus. But the Gospels don't actually explain what's going on. Jesus will teach, but his teaching is always kind of couched in this, either as parables or some other kind of mystic in John, no parables, but still some kind of mystical meaning that makes it kind of hard to follow. So even though there is some teaching going on, some explaining going on, it's still like, what are you talking about? Even his own followers didn't really grasp it until afterwards. You have to go to the epistles to actually get the meaning. And Paul will say in Ephesians, he's already mentioned it in 1 Corinthians, for example, beginning of 1 Corinthians, that this is a mystery, that this has been revealed to the apostles. God has revealed these secrets about his plan and purpose to the apostles, and now it's their job to reveal it to the people through their teaching, which is what Paul is doing, and the other apostles, most of whom did not write anything down, unfortunately. Peter, John, and Paul did. And so that's where the explanation comes in. That's why we now know, okay, this is what that means. When we are all condemned, we all stood condemned before God at his law court, at his judgment seat, at that trial. Satan was our prosecuting attorney, pressing the case against us. Now, he set us up, as we find out. We read about that way back in Genesis and throughout the Bible, that the Satan, the accuser, not only does he accuse, he actually entices people to commit the sins that he wants to accuse us of. But the fact is, we have all sinned. And we can't do anything about that. Even if we've lived the perfect life after our first sin, we can't undo that one sin. So what happens then? And the law can't do that either, as we read about in Romans. Like the law that, even the law that God gave, that 1,500-year period of time from Moses until Jesus, in which the law was an active governing body over the nation of Israel. Even during that time, with that law in place, the law itself could not do anything about sins that were committed. It condemned the sinner, but it couldn't do anything to save the sinner. And it could not empower the sinner to keep it. The law was weakened by our weaknesses. It could not actually empower us to live according to its standards. And once we fell short of its standards, which we were inevitably going to do, it could not do anything to save us. The law was not designed for that. So that's what the book of Romans is in a nutshell. It is the most comprehensive look at God's plan to save man from sin, death, and the devil in the scriptures, by first of all making the case that we're all sinners. We all stand guilty before God, but we need this intervention to be declared righteous, which God provides, which we can't do on our own, which we cannot obtain on our own. No amount of effort on our part will ever be enough to get that not guilty verdict. So God provides a way for us to receive that not guilty verdict and therefore not be condemned, and to be instead added to his family of saved ones and all the benefits that involves. It's not just a matter of not being condemned. It's a matter of getting all kinds of good things instead. But this has to be provided by God, because no amount of effort on our part will ever be enough. That is essentially the message of Romans. And then he's going to relate how that applies specifically to Jews and Gentiles, and how that matters to the fellowship of the church in Rome. So therefore, and that's essentially the message of the book of Romans. Now, why does the book of Romans take this shape, this form? Why is it like this? This is one of the most interesting questions to ask about the book of Romans. I've been saying from the very beginning, since we started this Read Through the Bible project 4 years ago now, the key to understanding is to put yourself in the mindset as best as you can of the people to whom the text was originally written. Now, this was a long time ago on the other side of the world, in a vastly different culture, speaking a different language. So this is not easy. We have advantages that they did not have, in the sense that we have the whole message right in front of us, which they didn't. I talked about how Moses only had about this much, and we have the whole rest of it. And we can read the whole thing in light of having the whole thing. Like we can read Moses in light of having the rest of it, which gives us an advantage that Moses didn't have. On the other hand, Moses had the advantage of having lived through this, of having gotten his message straight from God, of having been on the mountain and received the law from God, and all the other stuff that goes along with it. The people around Moses had the advantage of being in that culture, so they understood that culture. They understood the expressions, the cultural standards of the time. We need to make an effort to understand this stuff. We need to make an effort to understand why people act the way they do in some of these accounts, because they are different. They have a different way of doing things. They don't need to explain this, because when the people who wrote it down, when the people wrote it down, they assumed everybody knew. That's not the case anymore. Every so often you'll find an example where some later writer has to explain a custom of an earlier generation. For example, in the book of Ruth, when there's a scene where it talks about taking off your sandal or something to make a pact, or something like that. I forget exactly. I may be getting confused with something else. But the writer of that book has to then insert an explanation as to why that person in the story did that, because by the time he's writing it down, apparently that custom was no longer practiced. And so there are a few instances like that. For example, in the first Samuel, the writer has to explain that Samuel was a seer, and that prophets, what the writer knows is prophets. When the writer is writing it down to his audience at that time, or the editor, the final editor, whatever that was, the office of prophet was known to be a prophet, like the ones who come along and speak to the kings. But when in Samuel's day, before there were kings, and each town had like a seer, it was different. And so the guy has to explain, what it was like in Samuel's day. That happens occasionally. For the most part, that doesn't happen, because the culture didn't change a whole heck of a lot over the course of time, because human culture stayed stagnant for a long time. It's hard for us to believe today, because our culture has changed so much in the last couple of generations alone, but human culture typically does not do that. And so for the most part, most of the cultural standards, even in the early Old Testament books, are still in effect later on, to a large degree. But so they have an advantage in understanding the actual cultural setting in which the stories take place, because they were there, like they knew that they were in it. We need, so we have. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, I admit I got a little bit off track there. It's important for us to do everything that we can to put ourselves in the mindset of the people to whom these texts were originally written. And that's difficult. That's not easy. But once we do that, once we kind of crack that code, a whole new layer of understanding and meaning opens out in front of us. The book of Romans is an interesting book in that it doesn't actually explain itself too much as to why it exists. Why did Paul write this letter to the Romans at this time? In terms of his immediate cause for writing, he does say a couple things that are pretty obvious. He is planning on going to Rome, and he wants them, the Roman church, the Christians in Rome, to accept him and embrace him, and he wants to be strengthened by them and to strengthen them. He wants there to be mutual strengthening and benefiting each other. And then he wants them to help him. He wants them basically to serve as a base for him to go further west into the western reach of the Roman Empire, into Spain. He started in Antioch, way on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. He's currently in Corinth, or somewhere around Corinth. It seems as though he's in Corinth when he writes for Romans. He doesn't actually say that, but that seems to be where he is. So apparently, he did finally settle his dispute with the Corinthian church. At least it seems like it. He appears to be in Corinth probably in the spring of the year 57 AD. He has finished his tour of what we would call Eastern Europe. He has finished that collection project that he's been talking about now in the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians that's been mentioned in Acts. He's finally finished that. It's been 2 or 3 years in the making at this point. He's done with Ephesus. He's done with this region. He is going to be accompanying these men. He and these men are going to be going to Jerusalem with this collection project, this money they've gathered from the churches in Greece and Asia, Turkey as we would call it today. They're going to go to Jerusalem and offer this money to the church there as a sign of fellowship and unity between the Gentile and Jewish churches, congregations, I should say. And then he intends to go from Jerusalem to Rome to visit them, the church that he's writing to. I don't know how long he plans on staying there, probably a shipping season, probably. And then he's going to go from there on to Spain. He wants to use the Roman church as a base to support him, as a foundation, basically, to support his mission further west into Spain, where the gospel has not yet gone. The gospel has gone to Rome. He's obviously writing to a church that exists in Rome. So the gospel has gone to Rome. He did not bring it there. And that's one of the reasons why he hasn't been there yet. Because his mission has been to plant the church, to plant congregations in places where the gospel hasn't yet been preached. And it has been preached in Rome. So that's part of the reason why he has not been there before. And that's part of the reason why he does not plan on staying there for too long, apparently, once he gets there. And he wants to go from there further west to spread the gospel where it has not yet been. Of course, his plans don't actually turn out as smoothly as he would like them to be, as we'll find out when we read the book of Acts. He does go to Jerusalem, as he intended, but he gets arrested there. He will finally make it to Rome, but it's not going to be for about 3 years. And he'll be in custody when that happens, and he will spend 2 years sitting in a house, under house arrest in Rome. So he will finally make it there, but not for a couple of years after he intends to, and not in the circumstances he would like. But he is writing this letter to Rome in advance of his visit, which, as it turns out, will be delayed by a couple of years. He's probably planning on being there within a year by the time he writes this letter. He's going to, in fact, he probably plans on being there within about 6 months, because he's going to be going to Jerusalem, offering this money, and then going from there to Rome. And he'll want to do that before the shipping season ends. So he's probably planning on being there within about 6 months. It'll end up taking about 3 years. And so he's going to use this church as a basis for his mission further west. So that is like the immediate cause and effect of why he's writing to them. Now, why does the letter to the Romans take this form? Well, this is somewhat speculation, because unlike Paul's other letters, he doesn't appear to be addressing a letter to a specific need in that church that was brought to his attention. And he does not have a direct relationship with that congregation because he did not establish it, and he has not been to Rome. Now, he does know several of the people who are in that congregation. As we get to the end of the letter in chapter 16, he's going to list 20 or 30 people that he's greeting because he knows them, and some of them are even his relatives. So he knows quite a few people who are in the church in Rome. But he is not familiar to the Roman church overall. He did not establish a congregation there, has no connection with it other than knowing some people who are part of that congregation, and he has never been there. So in that regards, he's writing kind of a more formal explanation of his overall message than you would see in other letters where he's more directly responding to something that's happening that needs his immediate attention, like in Galatians or in Thessalonians or things like that. He is apparently not responding to an inquiry from them for information. Doesn't seem like it. What are you doing, Kat? What are you doing? Why are you doing that? Okay. I was just very concerned about something I saw that cat doing over there a moment ago. Unlike, for example, Thessalonica, where he had to write them after being chased away from that city so quickly, or in Corinth, where he was writing them, responding to a letter that they had sent to him, and responding to other crises that were going on, or something like that, or Galatians, where he's responding to something that happened there in his absence. He's not doing any of that in Romans. He is kind of introducing himself in a way to people who don't know him, and he is offering like an overall summary of his view of the gospel. I have to look at that guy. I don't know what your problem is. Now, so that's part of the reason why it's so different from some of his other letters. Another thing to consider is that we really don't know one of the big unknowns of the church one of history's mysteries, is that we don't know how the church actually got established in Rome. We don't know who first brought the gospel there, and we don't know, what was going on there, basically until Paul gets there, as recorded in the book of Acts. Now, of course, the Roman Catholic Church will say that Rome was the first pope there, and there is a strong tradition that he ended up there later in his life. I don't think he went there immediately. Like after he left Jerusalem in Acts 12, I don't think he went there right away. I think he did end up there, but I don't think it was immediate. So we don't actually know. From the time the church was founded in Acts 2 until Paul gets there, or at least until he writes his letter, there's about 25 years or so that pass, and we don't really know how the gospel got there during that time. The most agreed upon answer that I have seen is that after the day of Pentecost, some of those Jews who became Christians there went back to their homes, and some of them happened to live in Rome. And so some of them went back to Rome, and it just started there within the Jewish synagogue, as it did everywhere else. Now, there is some information, in both in the Bible itself and in other historical sources, that in the meantime, like somewhere in the 40s AD, there was a disturbance amongst the Jewish population in Rome, and the emperor at the time, Claudius, warned them and then eventually kicked them out of the city. We read about in Acts 18, for example, that Paul meets that married couple, Aquila and Priscilla, in Corinth, when he goes there, because they had come there from Rome since they had been kicked out by the Emperor Claudius. They apparently go back to Rome because they're two of the people that Paul greets in this letter. So at some point they went back. Claudius apparently, we don't have enough information to say this for certain exactly what happened, but it's what seems like is that there was a disturbance within the Jewish population of Rome, probably as a result of some Jewish people becoming Christians and advocating for Christ in the synagogues, and of course the synagogues fighting back against that, as we see elsewhere in the New Testament. Because one of the historical sources that talk about this say that it was at the instigation of someone named Christus that this happened, and that's generally believed to be a misspelling of the word Christ. Well, Christ himself was never in Rome. So probably what happened was, like I said, Jewish Christians came back to the city from Pentecost or somewhere. They began to establish themselves as a community within the Jewish community, a subcommunity within the Jewish community, and that caused tensions within the Jewish community, which in turn eventually caused tension within Rome. And after a period of time, the Roman emperor decided he had enough, and he ordered them all to leave. I'm not clear on whether that meant all. Now, it would not have been practical for Claudius to have gotten rid of all of the Jews. So that didn't happen in terms of just the practicalities. He may have issued an edict saying that they should leave. Remember, a lot of them would have been slaves, and they couldn't go without their masters going. And some of them would have. So I don't know if it would. I don't know how many of them actually left. I'm also not sure if it applied to all the Jews or only the Jews who believed in Christ, the ones that were considered to be the troublemakers. I'm not sure. We don't have enough information to tell that. But apparently what happened was that this congregation was entirely Jewish at the start. It would gradually have become more Gentile because more Gentiles would have become Christians gradually, as happened elsewhere. Then there would have come a moment when all the Jews, the Jewish Christians at least, left, or at least most of them did. And so then for a while, for about 5 years, until Claudius died and Nero came to power and revoked that policy. That happened in 54 AD. So for about 5 years, from about 49 AD to 54 AD, the church in Rome would have been almost entirely Gentile. It would have probably been the first close to 100% Gentile congregation. Then after Nero comes to power, he allows the Jews to come back in. So some of them did. We see Claudius and Priscilla and Aquila do go back. So some of them did, at least. I don't know if all of them did, but some of them did. And so now these Jewish Christians are coming back to a Christian community in Rome that is very different from the one they had left. And when you consider the tensions that exist between Jews and Gentiles, in particular in the city of Rome, in general, you have tension. And so a lot of the book of Romans is meant to kind of level out this tension and put Jews and Gentiles on the same playing field, acknowledging that the Jews did have special advantages and privilege that were bestowed upon them by God, and they did. They were the ones who were entrusted with the sacred writings, with the prophets. They gave birth to the Messiah. Okay, so they did have special privileges. But as it turns out, he says those special privileges didn't profit them any because they abused them. So he condemns all Jews and all Gentiles alike. Says that we're all sinners under God. We all need to be justified by God freely by His grace, through faith in Jesus Christ. The same method of salvation is available to all. And the privileges that the Jews did legitimately have ended up benefiting them not in the end because they did not use them properly. And so when it comes, and he talks at the end of the letter, when it comes to dealing with each other, be gracious to each other. Be mindful and respectful of each other's backgrounds and customs and traditions and values. And so that, I believe, is why Romans is the way it is. And that is the background to the high water mark of Scripture, the letter to the Romans.